I've been very lucky, really, in my life, extremely lucky, because when I was at school, I came across a book by McDougall, of all people, one of those very ancient psychologists. And I don't know what it would have been like if I'd actually come across something really more recent. But anyway, I read McDougall, and I suddenly thought, well, this is the sort of thing I'd like to do, is to explain things like he was explaining war. You know, they had no fear at all. They explained every big issue. And so I thought I'd go and do psychology at university. And to hedge my bets, I did zoology as well. I thought I might go into the biological side, because I was interested in some of the biological reading I'd done at school. Or I might go into psychology. I was very fortunate again in that I soon discovered that psychology was the thing, what I really wanted to do. And it's very amusing, because when you arrive at university, or when you arrived at university in my time, I don't know whether it still happens, you'd get some very serious man introducing the course by saying, many of you come here because you want to understand people. And then they would say, don't come here, go to English. Or go to some other department where they'll teach you literature. Because this is serious science, you see. We're not in the business of understanding people in that way, you see. It was almost enough to put one off, but of course I had hedged my bets with the sort of scientific side, so I thought, oh gosh, yes, that must be right, that must be exactly for me. I will go, I won't be one of the English lit guys, I'll be one of the people who understand things scientifically. And the other thing that kept me going, I was excited about it, so it really doesn't sound, I wasn't really working against anything, real terrible obstacle. But when I picked up a first-year textbook after McDougall, and I paged through it, I saw it was full of things that one really wanted to know. Enormous number of things, from motivation to social groups to mental illness to all sorts of things. And I thought, this is really exciting. And of course, this is what has attracted students to psychology in huge numbers at all universities for so long. The material is just so fascinating. And anyone who can point to, can promise, or even mildly and reticently indicate that they might be able to understand these things, is going to draw you, you know. So there I was, and I embarked on a course in psychology with, which turned out to be just as interesting as I thought it might be. We had a lecturer at Wits, a chap called Wolfemius, and Wolfemius was the sort of person who is remembered either with tremendous appreciation or with a certain amount of resentment. He was an extraordinary person, because there was this class at first-year students of, I don't know what it was, 250 or whatever, and Wolf never seemed to prepare his lectures. He would come in and he would start talking, and he would get other people talking, and the whole class would sometimes engage in this, and it was pretty disordered, as you can imagine. But there was always a sort of basic text that he'd said, read this, and we would talk about it, and if if the conversation went another way. Now, I loved this, but I've met other students who said, God, what a waste of time old Wolf was, you know. But I thought it was wonderful. So this kind of, it really interested me more, very much more than the more orderly lectures of other people in the department. We had a Professor Macrone, who later on became principal at Wits, and who's very ordered and very thorough, and I'm sure very systematic, and I'm sure I owe an enormous amount to him. But it was Wolfemius who really lit the fire. So you never know. You know, people tell you how to teach, but they never tell you, thank heavens, there's no one way, let's say, that'll be appreciated by every student. some people want the very ordered, very systematic approach, and it's tremendously valued. And I suppose the thing about WITS was we had both. That was doing different areas and different fields and so on. So that I then taught at school for a while. I wasn't sure that I wanted to go on, but eventually I did. I got a chance at UCT to continue. And at UCT as well, there were quite extraordinary psychologists at the time. There was a chap called J.G. Taylor, James Taylor, who wrote a absolutely remarkable book, The Behavioral Basis of Perception. Now, Taylor was the first person to make me see what a psychological theory might look like. That is, a theory that was precisely stated and started with very clear assumptions and very clear axioms. And he based his work on the theories of a chap who wrote a book on how to design. The book was called Design for a Brain. And Design for a Brain was one of the very early attempts to devise an intelligent machine. And this seemed the way to go. It seemed that if we want to understand how the brain works, we could either plunge our hands into the sort of messy biology and then try to think, well, what is this bit of mess about and what's that piece of mess about? Or we could say, our theory is so-and-so, and we're going to test it by building a machine that will actually be able to perform the functions we're interested in. And that, of course, as we can see now, became an enormously powerful stream in psychology. In fact, there were, at places like MIT and so on, the Center for Cognitive Psychology, the Center for Machine Intelligence, all these things developed out of it. And of course you can see the appeal of it. That is, if you have a theory, build it. And so it was thought that for a long time, and may still be thought in some quarters, I don't know, that this was going to eventually lead to the construction of minds. Now, we know this has failed. We know that nobody has ever created a mind. You can build a machine that can do many intelligent things like play chess and so on, but there's no indication whatsoever that they have any minds at all, and we can't really imagine even what would transform this into a mind creature. And this is it's still a very powerful sort of stream in psychology, but I think the aims are a little bit more, let's say, they're a little bit more restrained, a little less hopeful that one day this thing you will have built will suddenly turn around to you and say, my name is Van der Marwijk. Who are you? Or whatever, or you're not looking well today. I mean, that's possible. That could still happen because they are sort of, you can program a lot of this in, and it might ask if you press the right button or it happens to come across this in the right frame, is used to making sympathetic remarks, like, how are you today, and did you feel that way when you got up in the morning, on that sort of thing, and you suddenly find yourself blubbing and confessing to the animal. But you don't really, I mean, on cold reflection, you don't really believe this is a conscious animal. So mind still remains, from that point of view, the total mystery to beyond the reach of all these particular attempts. But nevertheless, when you think of where we came from, when I was a student, you had links between stimulus and response. That was the sort of scientific approach, and then you would get crossings and so forth. That was what you can call the sort of telephone exchange theory networks. And then, of course, this lifted it into a whole sort of now the program theory. But still, and the work is extremely invaluable because we need to know some of the kinds of things that a brain would have to do in order to solve problems. But we don't really know what is meant by intuition, thinking, empathy, mind, just consciousness, awareness, experiencing, which even very, when you look into the eyes of the lowest mammal, whether it's a porcupine or what, you have a feeling it's experiencing something. There's something going on. You may not have a mind as we think of it, certainly can't talk, blah, blah, but you have it's as an experiencing animal. There is something happening there which you never feel with a machine. No matter how many networks, programs, and things you add. Maybe one day, in 100 years' time, or 1,000 years' time, or whatever, somebody will say, this is it. But the answer, I'm sure, will come not just with increasing the complexity of the programs, but actually increasing the programs in a given body and in something which has biological capacities which we don't yet understand. There's something about the mechanism itself, about the body itself, which moves from program to experience. And once that has been crossed, that divide, maybe we'll have some sort of theory about then how complex minds are formed. So anyway, that I said when I came here, J.G. Taylor was just about to leave. And what was so fascinating to me anyway was that the book itself indicated what a theory might look like. And there'd been a lot of speculations, a lot of sort of fairly loose accounts, but when you compare them to, say, theories in physics or so on, physics was another subject that I had to do for a while, they weren't theories. The other branch, which I sort of had cut off almost because, having been told in first year that I should either do English literature or do real science, is what I call, and this is the most, it's the other really powerful development in psychology, is what I call rhetoric. And all things like psychoanalysis and Marxist psychology and the French philosophers today like Derrida and so on. But the point about it is that they regarded psychology, they didn't admit that it was a form of rhetoric. They regarded, you could say that this, the study of rhetoric would indicate to you how psychology, how the mind was shaped. All you had to do was discover the key to the particular rhetoric which was occurring. For example, it was the Oedipus complex, or sex, or repression of this, infantile exposure to dreadful experience of people making love and so on. If you knew the key in that case, which Freud offered, was the sexual key, you could interpret the rhetoric. All the occlusions, the subversions, the denials, all of these that shaped the mind rhetorically could be understood provided you knew the key. And that was what Freud did essentially, because if you look at the maneuvers, the metaphor, the dreams, the images, and so on, you can say this has been the stuff of literature for centuries. And of course it's developed more and more. The Marxist one, the Marxist interpretation, would say you can understand virtually all the things by understanding the interests of the group to which the person belongs. Things like the kinds of prejudice and Orientalism and the kinds of stories we tell about other people, other groups, and so on, are really disguises of our desire to subordinate them. Anyway, indications of our interests. So on the one hand you have the sexual notion, and the other the interest cue. And since then there have been various developments. I mean, like in games people play, it'll be enlarging perhaps the range of keys that are available to understand what is being done. But this is the kind of, when you ask people who are very gifted at interpreting what's happening in a particular exchange. They're using the rhetorical approach. They're saying, this is hidden. This is being used metaphorically. This is denied. You know, we understand the denial. We just have to look behind it to discover what the person is trying to do. In many ways, I regret that I bought the sort of scientific vision. Looking back on it, I think the most fascinating thing in psychology really has been the study of rhetoric. And if I'd realized that it was a question of the keys, and the elucidation of the keys to the rhetoric, it would have seemed to me a more systematic thing. You know, I would have seemed, yes, then that becomes the key issue, the main issue. You see, what are these sort of maneuvers about, and so on. Anyway, so between the two, and then when I came to, so that was James and his seduction along that particular path, and then this was balanced here at Cape Town by another brilliant lecturer, Kurt Danziger, who's spent the second half of his career in Canada. The reason was very simply that he wanted to go on study leave, and he was told by the then government that he could leave. Well, they told him that he wouldn't get a passport. He was able to get a German passport. I think he'd been born in Germany. At any rate, his parents were German, but I think he'd been born there, actually. And he was able to get a German passport, and they said, well, you can have an exit visa or nothing. So he went out and left the country. But what was crucial about his work in my development was the way in which he combined sociology and psychology. It was a sort of almost a sociological psychology that he was very interested in. And this, I think, broadened my understanding enormously of the sort of social setting of human beings and so on. And so right from the start, he was in this. And he's written since then books which are very, very, very acute analyses of the role of, though he didn't call it that, the role of rhetoric in structuring the human mind. And he's been very productive. In fact, even after retirement, he set an example to us all by writing yet another book called Naming the Mind, was his last book. It is, actually, he's still alive. I don't think he's writing anymore, but he visits South Africa now every year for a short period. Now, what he did, I think, was to inspire me to go on to do, firstly, an analysis of parliamentary debates, which I called politics of identity. But I had exactly that feeling about it. You're sort of aware of the tremendous ambition and the tremendous hope with which you started a piece of work, and then you're aware when you're finished of how awful it is, how slight a resemblance it bears to what you hoped for. So that's, once I finished a thing, I sort of push it aside. But anyway, and then what I was concerned with, so that's concerned, the politics of identity is concerned really with the identifications in South African political debates and so on. And one of the things and the ways in which the stories by which people are identified or groups are identified in South African politics, it was, because what I did was I just finished it and then I discovered somebody who'd done it the way I should have done it. You see, it was a historian, Thompson, who'd done a book called The Political Mythology of Apartheid. But what he'd done was just obvious and much more sensible. He simply took the major mythological themes in apartheid as whole narratives, you see, and which is what I hadn't done. So that was the first shame, as it were. The second one was became aware of the fact that this is a very strange period. It was the late 80s or the 80s something, when there was a conference at Seville by anthropologists, in which they actually almost, as somebody said, it was called the Declaration of Seville, and it was almost like the Middle Ages, because anybody who disagreed with this view that human beings were fundamentally peaceful was almost anathematized. And people who attended, some of the people who attended the conference, said they were just so browbeaten. There was such a consensus that they didn't dare to say, "Hang on, I mean, our history is fairly violent. Is it just a kind of matter of chance or something? You know, you go back and you look around you, and there are a lot of people killing a lot of other people." And I mean, it's just too astonishing now. I mean, we live in a world of car bombs and starvation and militant groups and hundreds of wars going on, and it's almost inconceivable that this could have happened. Yet there was that thing. And if you say that human beings are violent creatures, you are part of the problem, because you're encouraging this sort of belief. Anyway, so at the time, I then got interested, and I wrote a book on genocide, which is based mainly on history and social psychology and stuff that other people had done the field work, really. And just for my own satisfaction, and as I said, the astonishment I had when talking to students and so on, how they'd bought this and so on. So I used this to teach a little bit, and just awaken people to the idea that we're not uniformly violent, but we are, as it were, creatures that can be switched into one set or the other. And we are switched by something that I called ideological acceleration. That is, we see, on a minor scale, we see Malema as a sort of wonderful agent of ideological acceleration. You first induce fear, then you induce the kind of people who are causing you fear and so forth, and you go on, and then on a bigger scale, if you get a chance. And if you look at the great dictators, I mean, like Hitler and Mussolini, they were extraordinarily capable of firstly using an existing fear, which was very widespread, fear of everything. I mean, fear of starvation, fear of being conquered, fear of being beaten, and the humiliations of the country that they lived in, and then target people who were responsible for that. So you get this, and whole large numbers of techniques of acceleration, ranging from you find observable behaviors, and you say to every member of the party who's a good member of the party does this, that, and the other, wears a uniform, does something, so that you can pick out very quickly who is for you and who is against you, and so on. So there are a whole lot of wonderful techniques of this sort, which then get people into their little regimented groups. And before you know it, ordinary people who didn't have terribly much against others, I mean, they might not have liked them. They're generally, I mean, we live in a state of sort of mild dislike of almost everybody, especially if they belong to a different group. We sort of mildly dislike them, but then we can perhaps be persuaded to like them or dislike them. And the acceleration simply means that your mild disapproval, or fairly sort of, becomes a very acute thing. And so you can see, for example, how things like anti-Semitism, once you've had this acceleration process, can become an extremely dangerous thing, this focusing on a particular group who become responsible for all your problems. And once that's happened, of course, there's no rationality left, and so on. So that was and I must say, I think it was very much the inspiration of Kurt Danziger, this attempt to combine the sociological and the psychological and not to be afraid of being a psychologist venturing out of your field into what other people might regard as more sociology than psychology. See? But somebody has to put them together. So that's about it. And when I look back on my life, I think that I've been just very, very fortunate in working in a field which has so many interesting problems and has developed in such an interesting way. And of course, as a university teacher, what a kind of blessing that is. I mean, you're always meeting students who are so much brighter than you are. And when I think of some of the friendships and some of the people that, I mean, people like one of my students, Peter Collett, who's went to Oxford and is now living in Oxford, and the sort of work he did with Desmond Morris on non-verbal behaviour. You know, so not only so interesting, but so amusing. I mean, he's looked at, for example, politicians in a conference and how they express domination. And the big thing is, if you can put your arm over somebody's shoulder, you're immediately, of course, and letting somebody through the door, the superior person more or less ushers you as the female, you see, through the door. And he's got some wonderful shots of Israeli and Palestinian politician where the Israeli finally pushes against the door. Sorry, have I disturbed your... Is it still clear? No. So, and he's done huge amounts on flirting and on cross-sexual relationships and so on, like that, looking at the subtle indicators of behavior, showing how we, as a, have just exactly the sort of same species-specific kind of indicators for these things as birds and other mammals do, So, going off into a completely different direction, but so fascinating. I think that, we've more or less sold the subject, and it is, I mean, in the best sense of the word, in that the sense that students come in and they're fascinated. I would point out to them that psychology, in fact, has many possible combinations and developments. To go back a little bit, in the university, about 20 years ago or 15 years ago, just as I was sort of moving on into retirement, there was a great desire at UCT and possibly other universities to establish very well-defined schools and very well-defined programs. So that when you came to university, you could say, I could do psychology with a very limited number of other possible courses, because these made sense, it was said. Now, I would say, and fortunately that fell through, but it's not that I'm against programs, they must have programs, but you must also have the sort of, the sort of thing that we have in the BA degree where people can do almost anything. Now, that looks to somebody who's in a more directed field, that looks disgraceful. But I would just say, open a first-year textbook. Look at the subjects with which you can combine psychology if you developed any of these areas. You'll see it's almost anything. There's nothing wrong with doing psychology and philosophy. In fact, there are many students who do this combination. Or psychology and zoology, or psychology and physiology, or psychology and physics. In fact, I couldn't tell you which is the best combination to do. It's something you're going to have to find out, and you may not succeed. You may succeed too late. you may succeed retrospectively and say, oh my gosh, for me, this is what I should have done with my... But that's the way life is. And so I would say, no, I wouldn't try to advise a student about what to to combine with psychology in their undergraduate course, because we've had all the types, anthropology and psychology, the whole lot. You mention almost anything. And there has been some combination in which it has been good. You think of, for example, somebody says, quasi in psychology. Yeah, he becomes a teacher, he teaches quasi, and he becomes a teacher psychologist and guidance person. So their careers in all these fields, and which seem to the more orderly person, or to the person who's used to saying, look, if you're going to do modern biology, you must know a lot of chemistry, you must know a lot about genetics, you must do these things. These are things, and those are going to absorb all your attention. You haven't got time for anything else. And that's fine. But it's when they start to take over these crazy subjects like psychology and tell us how that should be. Yes, but this time I would follow the other route. Definitely, I would have said to Taylor, that is wonderful. It's not really what I want to do. It's not really what I can do or want to do. I'm going to go right into the rhetorical thing, and I'm going to go for that, and so on. But already, if I was starting now, who knows what would hook me? Because there's so many new things happening all the time. And but I think the last thing that would be interesting to me is the sort of, just talking purely personally, is the sort of stuff where you are stimulating different parts of the brain and correlating them with different activities. I think it's very valuable. It's very valuable for surgeons and in medication, and even for understanding the operation, but it wouldn't be But that is, again, that's a vital and valid way of studying psychology, as to all this intricate unraveling of, for example, the different connections and the roles of the different chemical substances, the dopamines and what have you, that are forming connections and so forth. Fascinating, but not for me. That I would have gone the other way. I would have I would have jumped straight into when the guy said there's the Ing Lit or this, I'd have said, no, I'm going to take the Ing Lit into psychology, which most people have done anyway.